This film on the F9F Panther will cover taxiing, takeoff and climb, normal flight, maneuvers, approach and landing, and securing. The F9F taxiing or idling on the ground for 1 minute burns up fuel for several miles of flight. Taxiing and maneuvering on the ground, therefore, should be kept at a minimum once the engine is started. Visibility from the cockpit is very good. The airplane will roll at slightly more than idling speed, although 50% RPM may be needed to get in motion. With tricycle landing gear, it is safe to taxi at fairly high speeds. So, if the taxi strip is clear, let the airplane roll freely, using the brakes for steering only. There is no stick or rudder control at taxiing speeds. The airplane may be taxied in crosswinds. Balance the wind force with differential braking. Make turns at slightly more than normal turning speed. To stop, retard throttle and apply brakes evenly. To save time, the pre-takeoff checklist should be combined with taxiing. Oxygen on. Tabs 0 degrees. Dive brakes up. Aileron boost on. Fuel quantity checked. Sliding nose locked. Hydraulic system on. Shoulder harness locked. Fuel system primary. Seat adjusted. Wings locked. Canopy cycled and open. Flaps set for takeoff. When you turn into the operating runway, taxi straight for a few feet to straighten the nose wheel. Hold the airplane with the brakes. Advance the throttle to 100% RPM. Tailpipe temperature is 755 degrees centigrade maximum. Oil pressure at least 20 pounds and not more than 45 pounds. Check that amber emergency fuel system warning light is off. Release the brakes. If water injection is to be used at the start of the roll, set water injection toggle switch to on after RPM has reached 100%. Do not use water injection with atmospheric temperatures below 10 degrees centigrade. Acceleration is slow at first, but you really get going after 60 knots. Steer with the brakes until the rudder becomes effective at about 70 knots. Lift the nose wheel at about 80 or 90 knots. At about 120 knots, slow, smooth back pressure on the stick will lift her off. Keep your eye on the tailpipe temperature and control it below 755 degrees centigrade maximum. Get the wheels up as soon as you are airborne and close the canopy. Hold the climb at about 130 knots until you reach a comfortable altitude around 300 feet. If you used water injection, turn the water injection toggle switch off as soon as the supply is exhausted. This will be in about 50 seconds. Then raise the flaps. Accelerate by relieving stick pressure until you pick up best climbing speed, which is about 330 knots. Maximum tailpipe temperature of 755 degrees centigrade should not be maintained longer than 5 minutes. For longer periods, the maximum temperature is 740 degrees centigrade. Remember, the tailpipe temperature increase may lag after a throttle advance. Now turn on the heating and ventilating systems. Set the automatic temperature control rheostat to off. Set the cabin pressure switch to normal. Turn on the cabin pressurization system switch. Hold the standby temperature control switch in the decrease position for 3 or 4 seconds. Then set the desired cabin temperature with the automatic temperature control rheostat. High forward speed must be maintained when climbing at full thrust. The normal flight characteristics of the aircraft are excellent. It trims hands off and is responsive to the controls throughout the entire operating range of flight speeds. There is very little trim change with changes in power settings or speed or with the operation of landing gear or flaps. Under all conditions of flight, the pilot must be guided by the limitations of airspeed and altitude as they apply to acceleration and the unrestricted use of ailerons in pullouts and turns. The maximum allowable speed is 535 knots, or a limiting Mach number of 0.875, whichever is less. At about 15 knots below the limiting Mach number of 0.875, the airplane will begin to vibrate or buffet. And as the speed increases further, the entire airplane starts to buffet with some tendency to yaw or roll. More push force will be needed on the stick to hold the airplane in the dive because the nose has a tendency to come up. When the speed brakes are extended, and this can be done at any speed, the airplane has a tendency to nose up. The speed brakes are very effective and can be opened to any position between full closed and full open. When the speed brakes are retracted, there is a slight tendency for the nose to drop, but this is easily counteracted by stick force or trimmed by elevator trim tab. An emergency speed brake dump handle on the pilot's left console may be used to retract the speed brakes in case of system failure. The stalling speed of the airplane with power on and gear and flaps up is about 120 knots at sea level. There is very little natural warning. A stick shaker gives warning about 8 knots above the stall. The stall is mild and may be broken by forward stick with very little loss of altitude. Ailerons and rudder remain effective throughout the stall. In the clean condition, accelerated stalls have been made up to 2 Gs. Power has little effect on the stall except for a slight decrease in the stalling speed. With gear and flaps down, the stalling speed at sea level is around 105 knots with power on, and from 108 to 113 knots with power off. The stall is mild, with good aileron control, and recovery is immediate with a small altitude loss if the stick is allowed to follow its natural nose-heavy tendency. Do not get the airplane in a position or attitude from which a spin may result. But if a spin should be entered inadvertently, recovery can be effected by chopping the throttle and using full opposite rudder followed by positive forward stick. The recovery is normal to that of a prop plane, with the exception that between 5 and 10,000 feet of altitude is lost from a one-turn spin recovery. Let's watch the Panther run through some permissible maneuvers. The aileron roll is smoothly executed with the aileron boost system operating. Full aileron displacement is limited according to the airspeed and altitude combinations shown on the acceleration charts in the flight handbook. The airplane is restricted against snap rolls. In making vertical turns, wingovers, and chandelles, the pilot is also guided by the maximum permissible accelerations according to airspeed and altitude. Loops and Immelman turns are permitted only when external stores are not carried. Inverted flight should not be attempted for longer than 10 seconds. Approach the pattern with a minimum of 1,200 pounds of fuel aboard to give a margin of safety. The approach letdown is made with the engine throttled back and speed brakes extended, losing altitude at about 300 knots, indicated airspeed. The nose will be well down, giving the pilot good visibility of the traffic and area below. As you enter the pattern at 1,000 feet, you will be carrying engine RPM at approximately 73%, with speed brakes up and speed about 250 knots indicated or below. Lower speed brakes. Lower the wheels as you slow down to about 215 knots. At about 150 knots, lower the flaps. Check speed brakes up. Hold 150 knots at about 73% RPM. Shoulder harness locked. Open the canopy. Check armament switches at off and safe. Hydraulic system switch on. Tip tank dump switch dump. Trim tab 0 or according to trim of aircraft. Arresting hook up for field landings. Check the brake pedal pressure. Let's look at the overall pattern for approach in the Panther. You will enter the pattern at about 73% RPM with brakes up and at the landing pattern altitude. You will plan your flight to enter at 250 knots. Lower the speed brakes. As the airplane slows down to 215 knots, lower the wheels. As the airplane slows down to about 150 knots, lower the flaps. Check speed brakes up. Hold about 150 knots on the downwind leg. The speed on the base leg is 125 knots. On the final approach, slow down to 120 knots. And when you are sure you can make the runway, chop the throttle and come over the end of the runway at about 50 feet altitude. Let's follow through on the approach. We enter the pattern at 250 knots with engine 73% RPM. Lower speed brakes. At 215 knots, landing gear down and locked. At 150 knots, flaps down, canopy open, RPM about 73%. Check speed brakes up. On the downwind leg, 150 knots, slowing to 125 knots on the base leg, and over the end of the runway at 120 knots to 50 feet altitude. Chop the throttle and hold the nose high for the flare-out. Fly to the ground with the tail down, but not in a stall landing attitude, and land on the main wheels. When you know you are down to stay, move the stick back to hold the nose up as long as possible. Steer with the rudder until it loses its grip at about 70 knots. The nose will rock over gently, and then brakes can be used alternately or together to steer and control the landing run. Light and intermittent brake pressure can be used for the rollout because the hydraulic boost ratio is 3 times the pedal pressure applied. At the end of the landing run out, raise the flaps. Normal landing techniques are used in crosswind landing. In strong crosswinds, get the nose wheel down immediately after landing to help keep the airplane straight. After loss of rudder control, steer by alternate braking. Carrier landings with the Panther are normal. It is imperative, however, that the pilot follow through with the landing all the way after he receives the cut signal, that he retains control of the airplane's attitude, position, and speed down to the deck and until the arresting gear has done its job. In the event of a wave-off or incomplete landing attempt, advance throttle smoothly to 100% power. Immediately retract the landing gear. Get the flaps up at 130 to 150 knots indicated airspeed. At a safe altitude, nose down to pick up speed and fly in clean condition until ready to attempt another landing. At least 220 pounds of fuel are required to go around. In securing the aircraft after flight, chocks should be placed fore and aft of the If the tail temperature is high, run the engine at about 60% for 1 minute to cool it. To shut down the engine, move the throttle to closed position. Turn the master radio switch off. Put the fuel selector switch to start emergency. Turn cockpit and pressurization heat controls off. When the engine has stopped rotating, turn the fuel master switch off. Turn the engine start master switch off and the generator and battery off. Shut off the oxygen. Install the surface control bridle and fasten the safety belt over the front of the stick. When the pilot sees that the canopy has been closed and the airplane is tied down, he can consider the airplane secured. In this film, you have seen how the F9F Panther is handled during taxiing and normal flight. Reference to your flight handbook will help you perfect your understanding of this airplane.